Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. It's my first time in Tasmania. I'm from Queensland. I'm a teacher. I've been really cold in the last 24 hours. It's very unusual. I had to get my jackets out of the cupboard. We only wear them for about a week in Brisbane and get advice on what to wear. But yeah, I just wanted to introduce myself because I'm new to this group. I came through Catholic education, 12 years of Catholic education, and knew nothing about the big answers in life. So what I did is what many of the young ex-Genners in the 90s, we went off to UQ to find the answers. I studied environmental science, a Bachelor of Arts, and I majored in geography and French. But after becoming suitably enculturated, I moved my major into Aboriginal studies and learnt all there is to know about how to hate my culture and critical theory from the inside out. After completing what I fondly refer to as my slit your wrist degree, I'm not sure, it was terrible. I felt so terrible. I left uni utterly nihilistic and without any answers, although I had been led to believe that I knew it all. I was woke. As you can imagine, with zero sense of identity or self-worth, I didn't fare too well and came back to study later as a single mum. As it turned out, my undergrad was not only depressing, but it was also useless, so I went back to study teaching. I started teaching in 2007. And when I got into the classroom, I was shocked. I discovered that I'd actually grown up in a bit of a bubble, and I found that the contract for teaching and learning in the classroom had largely been torn up. I worked in low socioeconomic schools and found that many kids were suffering from traumatic life situations, which was interfering with their ability to learn. So actually the tearing up of the contract seemed quite fair. These kids had far more hefty issues on their mind than learning about how to draw a neat graph or a timeline of ancient Egypt. I struggled on in teaching, but became interested in psychology and mental health, as this was the skill set that I was using most of the time in the classroom. That and some parenting skills and social work, youth work skills. Although I loved to teach, I wanted to be where I would be of most use, and I thought that this might be as a guidance counsellor. So in 2014, I went back to study psychology. In 2021, I graduated with my honours in the field of wellbeing, aka human flourishing. Two things happened before I completed my studies in psychology that led me to realise actually I won't be following the journey of psychology. Sorry, just scrolled right to the end of my speech. I don't know how that happened. Technology. I didn't have a printer. Okay. Yeah, so two things happened to me before I completed my degree. The first one was that the APS, the Australian Psychological Society, released a position statement on gender dysphoria and gender affirming care. And I knew that as a woman of faith, it just wasn't going to happen for me. I wasn't going to be able to do that. That I wasn't going to be able to go there. And the second thing was that I discovered classical education whilst tutoring homeschoolers in 2014, and I became thoroughly hooked on its potential benefits. So I decided to hand over my psychology degree and my hefty HECS debts to God for his purposes, and 6 months later I founded my business, Logos Australis, with a mission to promote classical education in Australia. So now I blog, as well as teaching in the classroom. I network, I speak to anyone who will listen to me about classical education, and I distribute books from American classical education publishers to the Australian market with the aim of making affordable curriculum that is classical. My talk today is going to unpack a little bit about exactly how and why Western culture has snubbed reality on its own terms and instead becomes obsessed with the shaping reality to fit an ideal, what we'll call hyper-reality. Now I'm sure, as we've heard, There's people far better equipped than to delve into the philosophical side of that. So I'm actually going to look at it, unpack it from an insider perspective and also from a well-being perspective. I'm going to have a look at some of the psychological mechanisms at play in our education system and public discourse. I'll then discuss how this is incommensurate with psychological well-being, which is the catchphrase in education and society at large at the moment, and how the renewal of the classical education in the liberal arts tradition is, in my opinion, an expression of what I call true human culture, and maybe the only true cultural response equipped to draw us back towards wisdom, harmony, and human flourishing. Okay, so to begin with, I'd like to do a couple of psychological profiling on some characters that we know from one of our favourite fairy tales, The Emperor's New Clothes. We know how it goes. We learn of the emperor who is taken in by swindlers. They successfully play him to invert his perception of reality, to believe in something that was not real, to the extent that he loses much of his wealth and all of his dignity. So in the emperor, we see the image of a vain, incompetent character. He is not interested in leadership. He's not interested in his responsibility. He is only interested in fashion.
Which ministry did he get?
Education. From a psychological perspective, this guy's a mess. He lacks meaning and purpose. He lacks moral direction. He's materialistic, hedonistic, and self-obsessed. Sound familiar? His poor sense of self leads him to seeking approval. He can't face up to the reality of his job as king. He's striving for validation on Instagram. He has superficial friendships and is surrounded by yes men. If in the emperor we see an image of modern Western civilization, we can also guess that he probably lacks a loving, personalised relationship with the creator and derives his sense of self only from the immediate material universe. Our namesake Christopher Dawson argued that the unpairing of our worldview from Christian theism through the Enlightenment produced a society of self-interested actors, superficial, disconnected from their spiritual heritage, lacking in shared values or social cohesion. From a psychological perspective, the emperor is suffering symptoms associated with psychological distress. And he is at risk. He's vulnerable to manipulation by bad actors, which is where the story goes. Story continues as the swindlers arrive in town, selling just the product that the emperor so desires. He's been scrolling, he's seen the ads, he feels that this thing that they are offering is the answer to that hollow feeling in his chest. It will fulfill and make him whole and finally give his life meaning. It's marketing 101, really. Identify a deficit, problematize reality, social justice, racism, which actually these things do exist, but exploiting society's immaturity and superficiality by presenting a product that's actually not fit for purpose, because the goal is actually not social justice or anti-racism, but power takeover. So we quickly find some big problems with the proposed solution. The swindlers boast of its wonderful cloth, but it comes with a caveat: the virtue of being invisible to anyone who is stupid or not fit to hold their job. The product doesn't actually exist. James Lindsay, who's a US academic who's been unpacking a lot about woke ideology. He started out as a mathematician, maths professor. He did this grievance studies, they call it grievance studies affair, where he had a bunch of fake papers which he managed to get published in social science journals to demonstrate how ridiculous the field has become. He says that negation of the real is established by creating an interpretive frame that deliberately causes people to misunderstand reality, disconnecting one from actual reality through images and constructs. The real is then replaced with a hyper-real simulation, the invisible cloth. So gender fluidity has replaced biology and gender. Anti-racism to replace racism. Equity, diversity and inclusion. These are some of the hyper-real simulations that we are being offered. Interestingly, Lindsay teases out a genesis of this negative thinking mode from the Enlightenment. As faith was gradually replaced with science, it defines a thing by what it is not. This actually originates in scientific method. You have to prove that nothing did not happen. That's the null hypothesis. That's actually the basis of scientific inquiry. And it works for material things, for the natural world. This project morphed into a more general negative thinking or critical theory, and then on to deconstructionism, and now has come to dominate all fields of knowledge. Everything has been, in a sense, scientified. Poetry and beauty is out, and it is bad for the humans. In wokeism, the negative thinking paradigm has now reached an hysterical climax. Woke denunciation even replaces the negative critique. Paulo Freire, an educational theorist and called the father of woke, called for a perpetual revolution of pure criticism and permanent denunciation of the world. This is in line with what Diff was talking about total incoherence. This state of perpetual revolution is an extremely disorienting experience, and I speak from personal experience here. Without being able to get a fix on what is real, the young, indoctrinated student is left with only a sense of grievance, and the only acceptable response to this is through activism. Without a solid grounding in a social context, without a cultural heritage, without a sense of identity or story to back them up, young students in the West are very vulnerable to this indoctrination. Like the emperor, they lack moral or intellectual maturity. The moral maturity needed to effectively detect and respond to the negative critique and emotional denunciations of their world. These students then go out to gain powerful positions of influence in the institutions and corporations that have such significant reach in our culture. Well, you know the rest of the story. The court, the public all follow suit for a range of reasons. The Cultural Revolution is in swing. With reality successfully denounced, no clothes has been successfully inverted to the finest suit ever. The swindler's job is complete, and they leave town with the booty. One thing before we leave the story, one more little thing happens that gives us cause for hope. When we look at the end of the story, the emperor has totally given up his dignity and manhood to the woke crowd. We see a call back to reality from the child. I have 5 children, and as any parent knows, children have an incredible skill at seeing and saying reality as it is. This ability can sometimes come at the worst of times, the doctor's surgery or the shopping queue. Joseph Pieper, a German philosopher, defined the capacity to say reality as it really, or perceive reality as it really is, as actually wisdom. It is the definition of prudence or wisdom. The child is not yet indoctrinated to doubt his lying eyes. He is the one who's wise. However inconvenient as it is, the child's wisdom is where Hans Christian Andersen leaves the story. To summarise my points here, I just want to leave 2 takeaways. The first is that the emperor, as image of your average citizen, is ill-equipped and vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation because of the materialistic view that they are founded in and because of their poor moral formation. And the second is that a manufactured reality, a hyper-reality, has become normalised and even preferable because it's utopian, it's an ideal that doesn't exist, and it has been actively implemented by its proponents for the purpose of power, as we know. So the next question we face is how to equip our young people against this twisted version of reality. I want to turn for a moment to examine a little more about the concept of psychological well-being. This is necessary because I believe the state of perverted reality being perpetrated upon our young is the cause, obviously, for greatest concern It is psychologically damaging and needs to be unpacked. Why did the APS endorse that position statement without regarding other possible approaches? Because it's activism, not healthcare. The term psychological well-being is interchangeable with two other terms in contemporary psychological literature, flourishing and eudaimonia. You may have heard of these terms. As most of you probably know, eudaimonia was defined by Aristotle as the ultimate good, the highest good, the ultimate goal or the highest good for learning. It's the highest good for human beings. It is not the result of external circumstances or feel-goods, though these have their place. To achieve eudaimonia, one must fulfill their purpose and develop their rational and moral capacities to the fullest potential. Augustine and Aquinas reframed Aristotelian eudaimonia within the Christian worldview and the means by which the development of these capacities was achieved. Education. For Aristotle, Augustine and Aquinas, eudaimonia or human flourishing was actually the sole purpose of education. Skip forward to the 21st century, and we see an explosion of the well-being movement promoted by researchers such as Martin Seligman. In the last 30 years, well-being has come to dominate psychological discourse and has grown in response to the increasing epidemic of mental illness. 1 in 5 Australians will be diagnosed with mental illness in their life. Student well-being was cited as one of the major issues of concern in the recent review by the Productivity Commission in January, and obviously is directly related to other metrics such as literacy, numeracy, school attendance, etc., etc. I mentioned earlier that from a psychological perspective, if we took the Western civilization as a client, like the emperor, we would consider it to be suffering from a range of mental health symptoms, many of which can be linked directly to the modern worldview. Call it naturalism, scientific rationalism, or secular humanism, this ontology is doing a very poor job of producing eudaimonic citizens. The link between this ancient philosophy and modern well-being paradigm seems to me like a really useful opportunity to examine and discourse with the mainstream, particularly in the realm of education. If education is the mechanism by which culture is transmitted, then it is truly ground zero in the cultural and psychological crises facing society. The most reliable and well-regarded model for well-being is Seligman's PERMA model. This evidence-based model presents 5 domains associated with eudaimonia. They are positive emotion, engagement or flow, so like what a musician, when they lose sense of time and space, or an athlete, they're totally involved in their activity. Positive relationships, meaning and purpose, and accomplishment, or an area of life that you have some mastery in. There have been some add-ons also, such as physical health, but this is the basic model used. So eudaimonic or flourishing person is ticking boxes in all of these domains. If we think of the emperor or Western society, deficits across multiple of these domains is obvious. I'd now like to turn to what I propose as actually the only response to the issues associated with culture, wokeism and well-being, classical education and the liberal arts tradition, or as I like to call it, true human culture. I do not use this term lightly, but intentionally, to highlight the scope and potential of the project proposed in classical education. So what is classical education? Many are working to define classical ed all the time, but it's quite a difficult thing to do. But I'd like to share a metaphor with you to explain. 2 sentences. The carpenter planes the wood. The rose blooms. If we focus on the verbs in each of these sentences, we see that planes is a transitive verb. The action begins with the carpenter and ends in the wood. The action is external. In the second sentence, the verb blooms is an intransitive verb. The action of blooming begins and ends with the rose for the purpose of its fullness. This lovely analogy succinctly demonstrates that where modern education is aimed towards employment and external goods and is utilitarian in nature, classical education's purpose is human flourishing. Classical education was the mainstream mode of education for the best part of 2,000 years, and as such is, as far as I'm concerned, as evidence-based as you can get. I was reading Anna Karenina and was surprised to see multiple references by Tolstoy to CE. His character Karenin declares that the new scientific education would be desirable if it wasn't totally amoral and producing nihilism. 150 years on, yeah, it's so true. And we sadly see that CE has nevertheless been replaced by scientific education, and so an exercise in archaeology is required. The pieces are there, but we need to put them back together, and those of us who are putting them back together actually haven't received the classical education ourselves. So it's a tricky business. Whilst in classical ed, we are talking about a cultural tradition belonging to the Christian West, many aspects align with cultural expressions across the world. This is why I have come to regard it as an expression of true human culture. I understand this through my knowledge of Aboriginal studies. This came to some benefit. And actually the Irish tradition, I play Irish music, I'm mad about it. So there's very similar threads in a lot of different cultures around the world. Actually, there's another book that's been published by Roman Roads Press, which is examining Chinese culture and how that actually has many aspects of the classical tradition inside of it. I suggest we can reduce and universalise classical ed via the principle of the Logos, the word, the revealed truth throughout creation. I think this may have been what C.S. Lewis was articulating in The Abolition of Man when he discussed the Tao, or the way from Eastern tradition. And yeah, the book. Because CE is a form of true human culture, good teachers naturally tend towards aspects of classical pedagogy. For example, logical argument, debate, as we heard about this morning, virtue and character formation. They love wisdom and curiosity with the little ones, great literature, language, philosophy, not so much the modern sense, and love of the arts, the beautiful, the true and the good. These all constitute fragments of the classical tradition. I now want to briefly unpack, and I know I'm running out of time, but I think we started a little bit late, a few of the broad principles outlined in a book called The Liberal Arts Tradition, which I don't have with me, by Kevin Clark and Ravi Jain. So it's like a really good overview. I sell it on my website, actually. It's a holistic view of the tradition. They unpack the tradition and connect it to the contemporary classroom, but interestingly also community. My aim here is to highlight aspects that are countercultural to modern education, aspects that pull education back out of the scientific paradigm and into what we call poetic knowledge. As you will see, this is really what adds wholeness back and humanity back into the way we view education and culture. The definition used in this book is that grounded in piety, classical Christian education is a transmission of culture through the church and a faculty of friends who love the truth by cultivating virtue in the students' body, heart and mind, nurturing their love for wisdom and faithful service of the Lord. The first idea I'd like to unpack is this idea of piety. Piety is unknown and perhaps a cringy term in the modern context, associated with a holier-than-thou attitude, like the Reverend Mr. Brocklehurst in Jane Eyre. However, for the ancients, piety was a foundational precept for society and the motivating factor for the education system. Piety means that self is second to duty, a dutiful disposition towards one's faith, family and society in that order, and it framed the moral world order. The concept of paideia is key here. Paideia, the Latin word for paideia is humanitas, meaning what it is to be a human culture. Paideia is used by Paul in Ephesians 6:4. Do not provoke the child to anger, but rather bring them up in the paideia of the Lord. Thus, paideia is a wraparound term for education and enculturation, and the method for cultural transmission. Piety then forms the foundational frame for paideia in that it shapes the proper loves. It orders right relationships of the individual toward God, family and society. Before training can begin, an education in love must proceed in family, in community and school. Piety, the fear of the Lord, is the beginning of wisdom. The second idea is gymnastic, training the bodies for the good of the soul. Essentially, gymnastic is the principle of an embodied reality. We are spiritual beings with a body, and that body is good and redeemed. In the ancient world, training the body had important practical implications for biological survival. In the redeemed Christian view, it was a less harsh view of the physicality and offered a more loving or positive view of our physical nature, still to be disciplined and trained. Descartes declaring, "I think, therefore I am," reoriented our consciousness into a dualism, away from the sensed world. We're all up in our heads. The liberal arts tradition requires that the body is engaged in reality as it is through the senses. I believe that this important principle of embodied learning is the very key to our current context, and it is inextricably linked to and informed by engagement with beauty and poetic knowledge. It comes through from early childhood. A lot of our early education is actually, in that poetic tradition, but we lose it once we get to middle school and senior school. An embodied orientation is like an insurance policy against the swindler that require a denial of the senses, of what we see, hear and feel, in order to perpetrate the hyper-reality. Gymnastic, therefore, provides a basis for a well-ordered perception of reality, a connection to our gut instinct, and a fidelity to poetic knowledge. Final idea I want to share is music, which is tuning the hearts to the real. Music education in the liberal arts tradition can be described as soulcraft. Carried out properly, it tunes the heart and makes one perceptive to truth and goodness. Aristotle says that it builds intuition. A properly tuned soul is a foundation of the classical education tradition. Without a well-stocked moral imagination, without trained sentiment, without a heart, there cannot be human flourishing. As you can see here, the idea of music is actually a broader idea than what we understand it to be, and includes this, and it's expressed through instruments and music as we know it to be, but it reflects harmony in the world, the harmony of the planets. They thought about how all of nature was in a sense harmonious, and the harmony between human relationships. As a parent and ex-music teacher, it is astounding to see that the immediate impacts of harmony versus dissonance on a child. We see this connection of gymnastic and music playing out naturally in schooling movements such as nature play or adventure therapy. So this is a foundational frame, and I haven't spoken about the actual liberal arts because that's actually something that's more known. But we are looking at culture here, at the water that we swim in. And it can be summarised as poetic knowledge as opposed to scientific knowledge. It is the first mode of understanding. In it we emphasise wonder, curiosity, imagination and beauty. And this cultural atmosphere needs to be familiar and normal in our school and communities. We must reorient our cultural metrics, our academics towards valuing this mode of knowledge. In addition to reason and scientific knowledge, it's not instead of. And it's a difficult task because we are pervasively aligned with scientific modes of knowledge. Even the music curriculum, the humanities curriculum, everything, the way that we transmit knowledge through, and as prescribed in the Australian curriculum, is basically scientific, I think. Okay, if I got a little extra time?
2 minutes.
Okay. I just wanted to leave you guys with a few practical ideas around human flourishing, the connection between human flourishing and classical education. One is the idea of chronological history taught and schema formation. So schema formation is about how children how we make sense of our world. So if we teach classically, chronological history is really important. We start the story of the world from the beginning and we build through. Children have a really good understanding and an ability to know who they are, to develop their identity and have a good ability to respond to the world and cope with challenges. The second is that poetic knowledge. It engages wonder, it engages the imagination of the child. And when I have taught humanities in this way in the classroom, the kids are excited and curious and interested, like the stories that Karina was sharing with us this morning. Imagination actually stimulates the experiential learning part of our brain. experiential learning is the most profound and deep version of learning that we know of in psychology. We retain memory, we retain learning when we actually go and do something. It's like learning to cook by reading a recipe rather than going and doing it. So when the children's imaginations are activated through their learning and through a story, they see themselves in the characters. They're in relationship to the characters and they're in relationship to the ideas, and therefore they're much more strongly encoded in their brains. There's a few other things there. I guess the papers are going to be published on at a later date. But one thing I did just want to touch on is that alignment with Indigenous culture in Australia. I don't agree with an adversarial attitude towards the idea of Indigenous culture in our country, because it is our country and it is the geography, it is related to our place and our individual sense of identity. And I think there's many opportunities for alignment with Indigenous knowledge principles. In fact, these really line up really well. So the proposition of classical education is actually radical cultural reform. This is a good thing. It is needed. We do not want our children to grow up nihilistic, superficial, or self-obsessed. We need them to be whole, well-rounded, equipped with skills and knowledge, but more importantly, to be well-ordered, to love that which is good and to hate that which is evil, to flourish and to resist incoherence and disconnection. That's it. Thank you.